Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Flower Power Wash Process Ethiopia from Pit Stop Coffee Company. And there's the bag right there. And Pit Stop, based out of Nashville, Tennessee. And this is their first ever appearance on this channel. And I did want to begin this review with a bit of a disclaimer, as this is the coffee roaster of my good friend Connor. So naturally there might be a slight bit of bias and favoritism in this review. That being said, I did purchase this coffee with my own money in the hopes of remaining as fair and neutral as possible, but I did want to put that disclaimer out there. Now, the way this review came about is when Connor reached out to us after one of our September reviews, asking if we'd be interested in giving him some feedback on this coffee. And I said to him that we would happily purchase it to both support their business as well as give him some of our thoughts on this one. So hopefully this will provide some useful feedback, as this right here is day 45. And recipe we went with for this coffee was a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 99 degrees Celsius, about 210 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the V60, which typically indicates a more medium fine grind. We did go a little bit more fine on the grind with this one as well. Now, roast profile, I did reach out to Connor today and I kind of asked him what he was going for in terms of the roast profile with these coffees. And he said that he was mostly inspired by places like Subtext and Tim Wendelboe, and he would most closely align a lot of what he's trying to do with the Barn. Now, the best comparison I do have for this coffee specifically is both Lil Wolf as well as Hart, and that's not necessarily overly representative of the roast profile, but it's something that I'm going to discuss a little later in this review as well. But to kind of give you an idea, it's on the more light side of things relative to a lot of other American coffee roasters, but I would not necessarily say it reached the same level of lightness that you might expect from a lot of the other Nordic-based coffee roasters. Hopefully that gives you a good idea. With that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 20, first impression, and we opted for the V60 with this one, and the first thing I noticed was a slight citric forward aspect. It was immediately followed by a more sugary stone fruit in the finish, as well as a moderate honey component as well. So there was a lingering florality in the background, but for the most part, it left a very vibrant first impression, and I said, okay, we already have one of the more vibrant washed Ethiopian coffees we've reviewed this year, so we're off to a nice positive start. We continue on to day 22. Ran through the Chemex, and it was another nice day of this coffee as it continued to feel a little bit more refined, at least in this sense, with the listed florality being more prominent and the most prominent feature on this day. The florality was slightly more candied with some slight fresh stone fruits as it opened up in the honey direction within the finish. So we were experiencing some floral components on the forefront and some more honeyed components on the back end as well. So a lot of florality in general, some pretty positive first couple of days. Day 24 opted for the April brewer, and the cup is the most vibrant it's been up to this point. And interestingly enough, Connor did suggest brewing with more flat bottom brewers, so maybe the April brewer would have been the way to go from this point going forward. But obviously with the limited number of April brewer filters, there's only so many opportunities we have for it. But this one was very nice, as it was a very floral forward cup of coffee, a notable abundance of white flowers at the forefront, as well as more of the fresh stone fruit brightness on the back end. Best day so far, and maybe it would have been worth revisiting this brewer a couple more times, but this is honestly the only April brewer day we have, so it might have been the best brew method for me for this coffee. Day 26 adjusted to some higher temperatures and a more fine grind, as I do know that Connor really likes to push the extraction on his coffees, and it actually worked out very well for this one, as it skewed heavily in the floral direction for the V60 as well. So there's definitely a lot of florality to be found within this coffee, especially with some of the quick adjustments we had made. One of the most floral cups we had experienced this entire year, as there's a very high level of white flowers and intermediary peachiness and some dark honey as well. A slight citric aspect, giving it plenty of the traditional Ethiopian characteristics, and this one did radiate an abundance of vibrant washed Ethiopian characteristics. Day 29 through the Chemex with the same adjustments, and it wasn't quite as good, as it was slightly less floral with a little bit more of a citric attribute to the cup. There's a slight peachiness, but for the most part it remains focused on the strong florality, with the listed honey continuing to remain quite pronounced in the finish as well. So experiencing a lot of the same themes, if maybe on certain days a little bit more higher in one direction than the other. Day 31. Same recipe with the V60, and this time I tried third wave water. So here's kind of the thing. I think a lot of people know this. I actually brew with very soft water, as a lot of my water recipe was inspired by Coffea circular. And Connor does suggest maybe a slightly more hard water, so he did include a third wave water packet, and I don't necessarily love experimenting with the water too much while reviewing a singular coffee because that takes one of the most important variables and it does kind of put things all over the place, but I did want to go with Connor's suggestion for this coffee, and I honestly had some mixed trade-offs to this one as it was a slight bit more, well, we'll say less focused in general. It's floral, but not quite as defined of that strong white florality. There's a notable citric component, peachiness, but also more pronounced in the honeysuckle aspect. So certain parts of the florality were a little bit more pronounced, other parts were a little less notable. The citrus was maybe a little bit more pronounced, and the peachiness was kind of in the intermediary sense. So a little bit all over the board, but noticeably different from what I was experiencing with our softer water. Day 34, same recipe with the Chemex and third wave water, and I was getting a lot of similar results with a slight bit more to the cup. So what I really noticed about the differences in water is that the softer water was giving a little bit more focus and definition to the cup, where this might have offered a little bit more, but that's honestly in line with what I typically experience from the water. And that's one of the main reasons I do like the softer water is oftentimes I do get a slight bit more clarity from it, even if at times you're missing out on some other things you might be experiencing from the cup. But this one right here, the florality was a slight bit softer and less pronounced, which was a little bit of a loss for me, given that that's what I was looking for the most in this coffee. Day 38, final notes we have, and back through the V60, and right off brew, it was skewing pretty strong in the peachy direction, which is a nice positive experience for me. Really love the peach, as well as an abundance of florality, but it does cool off into a slightly bitter lemongrass sense. And it's at this time I was perhaps experiencing the most of this kind of lemongrass citric component to this one. Perhaps a slight bit over extracted for the tasting wheel, as this is the day I did make this tasting wheel. And a little bit better in the finish, as there's a little bit more of the citric forward cup in general, but right at the start I was really enjoying the way that this coffee was brewing. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have one level 5 and a lot of level 4s, but let's start with that level 5. The florality, level 5, yes. And it's one of the first things I noticed within this coffee. And when I was messaging back and forth with Connor, I didn't give him too much information as to what we were going to be thinking, discussing, or even saying about this review. But one thing I said was, this is probably going to score a level 5 in the florality, and this was my third or fourth time trying this coffee. So I knew very well that this was one of the more floral coffees I'd had this entire year, especially relative to Nahan, Panamanian geishas. So this one right here definitely scored very high in that sense. Both the white flowers as well as a very notable honeysuckle component. So always this was going to reach that level 5 mark, one of the most distinct, vibrant, and pronounced floral experiences I've had this entire year. Then we have a bunch of level 4s. We'll start with the cleanliness, level 4. Yes, we have a washed Ethiopian coffee. Unless it's ridiculously and unbearably clean, then it was always going to reach that level 4 mark. And what's interesting about that is when discussing this coffee in general with Connor, especially his roast profile, he did say to me that the reason he opted for the Probat was to maybe get a little bit more vibrancy as opposed to the Lohrings, which do have a slight bit more clarity in general. So yes, this one right here, it did score that level 4. I wouldn't necessarily say that it was any bit higher than that, but I do appreciate the clarity that was coming from this one. Finish, level 4. Yes, so it did have a quite nice finish to it, and that was a lot of those floral components, especially that honeysuckle-like scents. And even then, it had a pretty nice, even finish for the most part. We might discuss that a little later, but level 4 for that as well. Sweetness, level 4. Yes, and this is one of the biggest positives I do have to say about this coffee is oftentimes when we're reviewing washed Ethiopian coffees, they do tend to come out a little bit boring, tame, and maybe dull while lacking that sweetness. So this one right here, being one of the sweeter washed Ethiopian coffees we've had this year, is a huge positive for Pit Stop, as I maybe expected that going into it, but the fact that they reached that in significant abundance, it's definitely a true level 4 minimum. That's a really nice part of this coffee. Acidity, level 4. That's something, again, I might discuss a little later in this review, but it was perhaps a slight bit brighter than I might have expected. There's plenty of brightness in this one, and once again, I might touch on that when we're giving our overall thoughts. Citrus, level 4. Yes, and as I kind of mentioned when making this tasting wheel, this turned out to be the most citric cup I'd experienced the entire time reviewing this coffee, so having that in as strong of an abundance as I did was a little bit of a shock to me, but it was that lemongrass-like component, which does kind of tend to indicate that it was either over-extracted or there was something that may have been a little off about this coffee. Nonetheless, it did reach that level 4 mark, right there alongside of the stone fruit level 4. And if I'm being completely honest, I was very surprised that there was no stone fruit note listed on here, as this was a very stone fruit forward coffee. It was perhaps the second most pronounced characteristic after the very strong floral components within this one. So yes, I definitely see that scoring that level 4 mark. And then we have one level 3, and that's the bitterness. And as I kind of mentioned, I think that was representative of the tasting wheel towards the end, as we made it on the day where it was coming out maybe a little over extracted, maybe a little bit more bright and citric in general. So that's why the bitterness is as high as it is. Last thing really worth discussing is the body at a level 2. It is a lighter bodied cup of coffee, even with the V60, fully expected. We have a washed Ethiopian coffee, so I don't think I have too much to add on that. But when looking at this tasting wheel, I do think that it's a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. So I'm going to start out with the positive, because there are a lot of positives I did take away from this coffee. And the first one I wanted to say is that I'm not entirely sure why there are so many well-known, well-renowned coffee roasters out there that can't release this type of Ethiopian coffee, because these are my favorite types of Ethiopian coffees, especially when they're hitting on the big 4: clarity, sweetness, florality, and a fruit component. This one had all 4 of those things, the florality in significant abundance. So it's really shocking and interesting to me that I've had so many washed Ethiopians over the years, and they seem to be lacking a lot of those components, especially the sweetness. Especially nice definition to those coffees as well. So I do appreciate this one right here being on the more vibrant side of things. And what I was alluding to at the start with Heart and Little Wolf is that they do tend to offer some more vibrant washed Ethiopian coffees relative to a lot of other coffee roasters out there. So that's why I kind of wanted to categorize this one with those coffees and those coffee roasters, because those offer some really floral coffees, some really sweet coffees as well. And I know that Heart has made the transition to the IMF, but I do believe once upon a time they did have some very sweeter Probat-based Ethiopian coffees, but I know that Little Wolf does have them as well. And I think that all using the Probat, or at least once upon a time using the Probat, does kind of demonstrate the similarities that you can experience from these types of coffees, at least in terms of that sweeter profile, even if it is at the cost of some slight clarity. Now, the one knock I did want to give on this coffee, and it's a little bit of an anecdote. When I first began cupping coffee, I don't even remember how many years ago, I used to go and I used to try a lot of the coffees alongside some home roasted things. And what I was able to notice about those home roasted coffees is that they had maybe a little bit uneven of a brightness or an acidity. And that's kind of what I noticed about this coffee. And that's why it's interesting that the acidity scored as high as it did. And I said that it was interesting there. And the bitterness and that kind of lemongrass component was there as well. It could have been on me. I could have messed up the brew, but I do feel like the entire time I was drinking this coffee, I could kind of tell that it was just a little different from maybe coffee roasters that had been doing this for a very long time. And that's the biggest knock I have, is that it didn't quite feel as even in the brightness, specifically in the acidity, as those other coffee roasters that may have been doing this for a very long time. So I feel like if that thing gets ironed out, then you might be able to see this coffee a little bit just more even, well balanced in general, and I might not have necessarily messed up that final part, but it did go to show just how different a lot of the things within this coffee were when we were brewing with different waters. But just in general, that's kind of the more unique takeaway I have from this one. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to is somebody that likes their much more vibrant washed Ethiopian coffees, because I do feel like that was the biggest takeaway I had right from the start. You could tell that this one didn't take too much work to get the best out of it, as this one was very sweet right from the start. I've been alluding to that slightly uneven aspect of this coffee, but that aside, I think a lot of people would really enjoy this because it was easy to brew. You were able to get a lot of sweetness, a lot of florality, a lot of fruit components to it, as well as great clarity in general. Even if at times you feel like I'm not doing something right with this coffee, or maybe this coffee isn't 100% exactly where it should be, it still was forgiving enough to create a very nice coffee regardless of what you're doing. So keep those big 4 in mind: florality, sweetness, clarity, as well as fruit components, and maybe a little bit of additional brightness to kind of complement all of those things. I think that's the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Flower Power Wash Processed Ethiopia from Pit Stop Coffee Company. Thank you for watching.